Every morning, millions of Americans over 60 follow the exact routine their doctor recommended, and their insulin resistance keeps getting worse. Not because they're lazy, not because they're careless, but because four of the most trusted health habits for this age group are quietly working against the very system they're trying to fix. Data patterns tracked by the CDC show that adults over 60 represent the fastest growing segment experiencing worsening metabolic markers, even among those actively managing their condition. Here at Metabolic Health Simplified, Dr. Rubio Santner has spent years untangling exactly why well-meaning routines backfire after 60, and more importantly, what the clinical evidence actually says you should do instead. Today, we're walking through 8 critical points, and when we get to number 5, the protein strategy alone may completely change how you think about your next meal. So before we dive in, what does your typical breakfast look like right now? Drop it in the comments below. It helps Dr. Santner tailor the science directly to where you are today. Now let's get into it. Number 1. Picture this. You wake up, check your numbers, feel reasonably okay, and head to the kitchen to do everything right. Whole grain toast, a glass of orange juice, maybe some low-fat yogurt with a handful of fruit on the side. You've been told this is the responsible choice, the safe choice, the diabetic-friendly choice. But here is where the clinical picture gets uncomfortable. Research patterns highlighted by Harvard Medical School indicate that many of these so-called diabetic-friendly breakfast staples share one deeply problematic characteristic for adults over 60. They carry a glycemic load that triggers a rapid and significant insulin demand first thing in the morning, precisely when the aging metabolic system is at its most vulnerable. Think of your insulin system like a delivery truck at the start of a long shift. In your 30s, that truck has a powerful engine, fresh tires, and responds instantly. After 60, that same truck is still on the road, but the engine runs hotter, the response time is slower, and flooding it with a full load the moment it starts the ignition causes wear that compounds every single day. Now pause right here for a second. This isn't about guilt. You were handed incomplete information by a system that often defaults to outdated dietary templates. The American Diabetes Association has progressively updated its nutritional guidelines over the last decade, moving away from blanket endorsements of whole grains and fruit juice for people managing blood sugar, precisely because the evidence on post-meal glucose spikes in older adults demanded a more nuanced position. What this means practically for you is this. That orange juice, even 100% natural, no sugar added, can carry the glycemic equivalent of several teaspoons of sugar hitting your bloodstream within minutes of waking. The low-fat yogurt with fruit? The removal of fat often means added sugars were introduced to compensate for flavor. And whole grain toast, while genuinely superior to white bread, still converts to glucose rapidly enough to challenge an already stressed insulin response in the 60-plus body. The corrective shift here isn't dramatic. It's precise, and it sets the foundation for everything else we're going to cover today. Number 2. There is a deeply human tendency, when handed a prescription, to feel like the problem is being handled. The pill is working. The numbers look steadier. The doctor seems satisfied. So the dietary discipline quietly loosens. The movement habits slide, and the underlying metabolic dysfunction continues advancing, completely hidden behind a chemical management layer that was never designed to carry the full load alone. This is not a criticism of medication. It is a clarification of what medication was actually built to do. A pattern consistently observed across clinical models published in JAMA indicates that pharmacological intervention for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is most effective when used as a support tool alongside genuine lifestyle modification, not as a standalone solution. Mayo Clinic research frameworks echo this directly, noting that medication can normalize surface-level glucose readings while the root drivers of insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, visceral fat accumulation, and cellular receptor dysfunction continue progressing underneath. Think of it this way. Imagine your home has a slow, persistent roof leak. Medication is the bucket placed strategically on the floor. It catches enough water to keep the immediate damage manageable, but the structural problem, the crack in the roof, is still widening every season. The bucket never fixes the roof. For adults over 60, this distinction carries particular weight. The aging body already faces a natural decline in insulin receptor sensitivity, a process researchers at Johns Hopkins have associated with the gradual reduction of mitochondrial efficiency in muscle cells after the sixth decade of life. Layering pharmaceutical dependency on top of an already declining system without addressing the root metabolic environment can create a false ceiling, a point where dosages keep climbing but functional metabolic health keeps quietly eroding. The most important thing to understand here is this. If your numbers look controlled on paper, but you are still experiencing chronic fatigue, unexplained weight retention around the midsection, brain fog, or disrupted sleep, those are signals that the roof is still leaking. The bucket is simply doing its job quietly enough that the deeper repair keeps getting postponed. Medication has its place, a critical, sometimes life-saving place, but it was never meant to be the entire strategy. And for the 60-plus body specifically, treating it as such may be the most quietly costly mistake of all. Number 3. If you have been faithfully walking on the treadmill for 45 minutes every morning, or cycling steadily at a moderate pace 3 times a week, and your insulin resistance markers are still stubbornly elevated, this chapter is going to explain exactly why. And the answer is going to feel counterintuitive in the best possible way. For decades, steady-state cardio has been the default exercise prescription handed to older adults managing metabolic conditions. Walk more. Keep your heart rate moderate. Stay consistent. It sounds logical. It sounds safe. And for general cardiovascular maintenance, there is genuine value in it. But when the specific goal is improving insulin sensitivity in the 60-plus body, the clinical picture tells a more complicated story. Research frameworks from the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism suggest that prolonged moderate-intensity cardio sessions, particularly when performed in a fasted or semi-fasted morning state, can trigger a measurable cortisol elevation response in older adults. And here is where the metabolic problem compounds. Cortisol, your body's primary stress hormone, directly interferes with insulin receptor signaling. Elevated cortisol essentially instructs your cells to become temporarily more resistant to insulin, not less. You are exercising to improve the system, but the hormonal response to that specific exercise style is partially working in the opposite direction. Think of it like trying to cool your house by opening the windows during a heat wave. The intention is completely right. The execution, given the specific conditions, produces the opposite result. Johns Hopkins research on exercise physiology in older adults points toward a more targeted approach, one that incorporates brief, structured, resistance-based movement and post-meal activity rather than exclusively relying on long, fasted cardio sessions. The reasoning is elegant. Muscle tissue is the body's single largest consumer of glucose. When muscle fibers are actively recruited through resistance or functional movement, they can absorb circulating glucose independently of insulin, essentially creating a secondary disposal pathway that bypasses the resistance problem entirely. Now, this does not mean abandoning walking or gentle cardio. It means understanding that for insulin resistance reversal specifically, the type, timing, and structure of movement matters as much as the duration. We will cover the precise protocol that clinical models support later in this video. But first, there are 2 more hidden saboteurs that need to be on your radar. Number 4. Here is something that almost never comes up in a standard 15-minute doctor's appointment. You can eat perfectly. You can take every prescribed medication on schedule. You can walk faithfully every single morning. And your insulin resistance can still be worsening. Silently, steadily, and completely driven by something happening not in your kitchen or your gym, but in your nervous system. Chronic stress in the 60-plus body is not simply an emotional inconvenience. It is a direct and measurable metabolic disruptor. And the mechanism behind it is precise enough that researchers at Harvard Health have identified it as one of the most under-addressed contributors to treatment-resistant insulin resistance in older adult populations. Here is how the biology works. When your body perceives stress, whether that stress comes from a difficult relationship, financial pressure, chronic pain, disrupted sleep, or even the low-grade anxiety of managing a health condition itself, your adrenal glands release cortisol. This is normal and necessary in short bursts. But when cortisol remains chronically elevated, as it does in persistent stress states, It triggers a cascade that directly undermines insulin function at the cellular level. A landmark research framework published in The Lancet described this mechanism with particular clarity. Chronically elevated cortisol instructs the liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream, even when you haven't eaten. Simultaneously, it reduces the sensitivity of insulin receptors on muscle and fat cells, meaning the insulin your pancreas is already working hard to produce becomes progressively less effective at doing its job. Your pancreas responds by producing even more insulin, and that sustained overproduction is precisely what accelerates receptor burnout over time. Think of it like a factory manager who keeps sending urgent override signals to the production floor. The workers, your insulin receptors, start tuning out the constant noise. Not out of failure, out of exhaustion. For adults over 60, this dynamic carries extra weight for a specific biological reason. The aging body already produces cortisol less efficiently than younger systems, meaning chronic stress lingers in the bloodstream longer and clears more slowly. What a 35-year-old metabolizes and resets from in hours, a 65-year-old body may carry for the better part of a day. The practical implication here is significant. Any insulin resistance recovery strategy that ignores the cortisol variable is working with one hand tied behind its back. Stress management is not a soft lifestyle suggestion. For the 60-plus metabolic system, it is a clinical necessity. And the good news, because there absolutely is good news, starts right now with our next chapter. Number 5. We have spent the last 4 chapters mapping the hidden landscape of what is quietly working against you. Now we shift direction entirely. Because the clinical evidence on insulin resistance recovery in older adults is not all cautionary, some of it is genuinely exciting. And this chapter contains what may be the single most underutilized dietary correction available to the 60-plus body today. Most older adults managing insulin resistance have been coached primarily around carbohydrate reduction. Watch the bread, limit the rice, avoid the sugar. And while carbohydrate awareness absolutely matters, this singular focus has created a significant blind spot, one that the American Diabetes Association has been quietly correcting in its updated nutritional frameworks over the last several years. That blind spot is protein. Specifically, the dramatic underutilization of dietary protein as an active metabolic recovery tool rather than simply a passive macronutrient. Here is what the clinical picture shows. Research patterns documented in JAMA indicate that adequate dietary protein intake in adults over 60 serves a function far beyond basic muscle maintenance. High-quality protein consumption triggers a hormonal response that includes the release of glucagon, a pancreatic hormone that works in direct counterbalance to insulin, helping regulate blood glucose levels and reduce the demand placed on an already stressed insulin system. Simultaneously, protein has a significantly lower glycemic impact than carbohydrates, meaning it supports satiety and blood sugar stability without triggering the rapid insulin demand spikes that worsen receptor sensitivity over time. Think of protein as the structural repair crew your metabolic system has been waiting for. While carbohydrate restriction clears the debris, adequate protein intake actively rebuilds the framework, restoring muscle tissue that directly improves glucose disposal and signaling hormonal pathways that support insulin receptor recovery. Now pause here for just a moment, because this next detail matters enormously for the 60-plus body specifically. After the age of 60, a biological process called anabolic resistance begins to emerge, meaning the body becomes progressively less efficient at converting dietary protein into functional muscle tissue. Research frameworks from the American Diabetes Association indicate that this means older adults actually require meaningfully higher protein intake than younger populations to achieve the same metabolic benefit. The standard recommended daily allowance, designed for general population averages, is widely considered insufficient for adults actively managing insulin resistance after 60. The practical correction here is straightforward. Prioritizing a high-quality protein source, eggs, fatty fish, lean poultry, or legumes, at every single meal, particularly breakfast, can begin shifting the metabolic environment within weeks. Not months, weeks. And that shift creates the hormonal foundation that makes every other recovery strategy in this video work significantly more effectively. Number 6. What if one of the most clinically supported strategies for reducing post-meal glucose spikes required no special equipment, no gym membership, no dietary overhaul, and less than 2 minutes of your time? And what if most people managing insulin resistance after 60 have never once been told about it during a standard medical appointment? That is not a hypothetical. It is the current reality for the majority of older adults navigating this condition. Here is the science behind it. When you finish a meal, your digestive system begins breaking down food into glucose, which enters the bloodstream over the following 30 to 90 minutes. This post-meal window, clinically referred to as the postprandial period, represents the single highest spike risk in your daily glucose cycle. For adults with insulin resistance, this window is where the most significant metabolic damage accumulates over time because the insulin response is already compromised and cannot efficiently clear the incoming glucose load. Research frameworks published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine and supported by clinical observations at Mayo Clinic indicate that brief, low-intensity physical activity performed immediately after eating can produce a measurable and meaningful reduction in postprandial glucose levels. The mechanism is direct and elegant. When your muscles are gently activated, even through something as simple as a slow 2 to 3 minute walk around your home or yard, they begin drawing glucose from the bloodstream through a pathway that operates partially independently of insulin signaling. Your muscle cells, when in motion, can absorb circulating glucose without waiting for the insulin receptor handshake that resistance has made unreliable. Think of it like opening a secondary drain in the sink that is filling too fast. The primary drain, your insulin response, is partially blocked. The secondary drain, active muscle tissue, bypasses that blockage entirely and begins clearing the excess on its own. Now, the critical detail here is timing. The research is specific on this point. The benefit is most pronounced when the movement begins within 15 to 20 minutes of finishing a meal and sustained for at least 2 to 3 minutes of gentle, continuous motion. This is not a workout. It is not intended to be strenuous or taxing. A slow walk to the mailbox and back. A gentle pace around the living room. Light standing movement in the kitchen while tidying up after eating. Any of these qualify. For the 60-plus body dealing with joint sensitivity, fatigue, or mobility considerations, this approach carries an additional advantage. It requires no recovery time, produces no cortisol spike from overexertion, and can be implemented at every single meal starting today. Clinical models suggest that when practiced consistently across all 3 daily meals, this habit alone may contribute meaningfully to reducing the cumulative postprandial glucose burden that drives long-term insulin receptor deterioration. Small window, significant impact. And it starts the moment you push back from the table. Number 7. Intermittent fasting has spent the last several years oscillating between viral health trend and mainstream controversy. And for adults over 60 managing insulin resistance, that noise has created a genuinely damaging amount of confusion. Some have attempted aggressive fasting protocols designed for younger, metabolically healthier bodies and experienced fatigue, dizziness, and muscle loss. Others have dismissed the concept entirely based on those cautionary stories. Both responses, while understandable, may be causing older adults to miss one of the most clinically supported metabolic recovery tools available to them. When applied correctly for their specific biology, the distinction that matters here is this. There is a significant clinical difference between aggressive intermittent fasting, extended restriction windows of 18 to 24 hours, popularized in fitness culture, and the more moderate, age-appropriate eating window approach that Johns Hopkins medicine researchers have studied specifically in the context of metabolic recovery. Research frameworks from Johns Hopkins Medicine indicate that a structured eating window of approximately 10 to 12 hours, meaning all daily meals are consumed within a consistent 10 to 12-hour period with no caloric intake outside that window, can meaningfully support insulin sensitivity restoration without the physiological stress that more aggressive protocols impose on the aging body. This is not deprivation. For most people, it simply means finishing dinner by 7 p.m. if breakfast begins at 7 a.m., or finishing by 6 p.m. if the day starts with an earlier meal. The metabolic mechanism behind this approach is grounded in cellular repair science. Research published in Cell Metabolism journal identified that during the fasting hours between meals, particularly the extended overnight window, the body initiates a process called autophagy, a form of deep cellular housekeeping in which damaged cellular components, including dysfunctional insulin receptors, are broken down and recycled. Think of it as the body's overnight maintenance crew arriving to repair the infrastructure that daytime activity has worn down. The longer and more consistent that overnight window, the more thorough the repair cycle becomes. For adults over 60, this overnight repair function carries particular relevance. The aging body's cellular repair mechanisms are already operating at reduced efficiency compared to younger systems. Consistently extending and protecting the overnight fasting window, even modestly, may help compensate for that natural decline by giving the repair cycle the uninterrupted time it requires to function meaningfully. Now, a critical practical note here. This approach should never involve skipping meals or dramatically reducing caloric intake, particularly given the protein priority we established in Chapter 5. The goal is consistent timing and a protected overnight window, not restriction. Adequately nourished cells repair far more effectively than depleted ones. And for anyone managing existing metabolic conditions or taking medication that requires food intake at specific intervals, any adjustment to eating timing should always be discussed with a qualified healthcare provider before implementation. The window is not about what you remove. It is about giving your system the uninterrupted space it needs to do the repair work it was always capable of performing. Number 8. There is a final layer to the insulin resistance puzzle that rarely surfaces in standard metabolic health conversations, and yet the research supporting its significance is both substantial and remarkably consistent. You can restructure your breakfast. You can implement the post-meal movement habit. You can protect your overnight repair window. And your recovery can still plateau, quietly and frustratingly, if 3 specific nutritional deficiencies remain unaddressed underneath everything else. These are not obscure supplementation trends. They are clinically documented micronutrient gaps that the National Institutes of Health and Harvard School of Public Health have each independently identified as disproportionately prevalent in adults over 60. And each one carries a direct, measurable impact on insulin receptor function and glucose metabolism. The first is magnesium. Research frameworks from the NIH indicate that magnesium plays a foundational role in over 300 enzymatic reactions in the human body, including the precise cellular signaling pathway through which insulin receptors recognize and respond to insulin. Clinical observations suggest that adults with chronically low magnesium levels demonstrate measurably reduced insulin sensitivity compared to those with adequate levels, and that magnesium deficiency is significantly more common in the 60-plus population than standard screening typically detects. Dark leafy greens, pumpkin seeds, almonds, and black beans represent some of the most bioavailable food-first sources available. The second is vitamin D. Harvard School of Public Health research frameworks have identified a consistent association between vitamin D insufficiency and worsened insulin resistance markers across multiple population studies. The mechanism appears to involve vitamin D's role in regulating pancreatic beta cell function, the very cells responsible for producing the insulin your body depends on. After 60, the skin's ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight declines significantly, and dietary intake alone rarely compensates adequately. Fatty fish, egg yolks, and fortified foods represent accessible dietary sources, though clinical models suggest that many older adults require targeted guidance on appropriate supplementation levels from their healthcare provider. Think of magnesium and vitamin D together as the electrical wiring behind your metabolic system. The food strategies, the movement habits, the timing protocols, these are all powerful switches. But if the wiring itself is compromised, the switches cannot perform at full capacity regardless of how precisely they are operated. The third micronutrient is chromium. Research patterns documented by the NIH indicate that chromium plays a specific and underappreciated role in enhancing the action of insulin at the receptor level, essentially helping insulin complete its job more efficiently once it arrives at the cell. Broccoli, green beans, grass-fed beef, and whole oats represent some of the most practical dietary sources for older adults. And while chromium deficiency is less dramatically discussed than magnesium or vitamin D, its quiet impact on insulin signaling efficiency makes it a genuinely important piece of the recovery framework. Now, a critically important note before we move forward. Micronutrient status is highly individual. The presence or absence of these deficiencies varies significantly from person to person based on existing diet, medication interactions, digestive absorption capacity, and underlying health conditions, all of which are particularly variable in the 60-plus population. Before adjusting supplementation of any kind, a conversation with your healthcare provider and appropriate laboratory testing represents the responsible and safest first step. Food-first strategies carry the lowest risk and the broadest benefit, and they are always the most sensible starting point. What this chapter ultimately reveals is that insulin resistance recovery is never a single lever problem. It is a layered system. And when every layer, the meals, the movement, the timing, and the nutritional foundation, is addressed with the precision the 60-plus body actually requires, the cumulative effect can be genuinely and meaningfully transformative. What we have covered today is not a collection of generic health tips recycled from a wellness blog. It is a precise, layered map of exactly why so many adults over 60 are doing everything they believe is right and still watching their metabolic health quietly decline. And more importantly, it is a clinically grounded framework for what actually moves the needle for the specific biology you are living in right now. Let us bring it together one final time. The breakfast foods you were told were safe may be triggering the very insulin spikes that deepen resistance. The medication managing your numbers on paper may be masking a structural problem that continues advancing underneath. The exercise routine you have faithfully maintained may be generating a cortisol response that partially undermines the very goal you are working toward. And the chronic stress woven into daily life after 60 may be hijacking your insulin receptors more powerfully than any dietary mistake ever could. But here is what the evidence also shows. Shifting your protein priority restructures your hormonal environment in weeks. 2 minutes of gentle movement after every meal activates a glucose disposal pathway that bypasses resistance entirely. A consistent, moderate eating window gives your cellular repair systems the overnight space they need to restore receptor function. And addressing the 3 most clinically documented micronutrient gaps, magnesium, vitamin D, and chromium, rebuilds the nutritional foundation that every other strategy depends on. None of this requires perfection. None of it requires dramatic deprivation or punishing routines. It requires precision. And precision, applied consistently to the right levers, is what genuine metabolic recovery after 60 actually looks like. I am Dr. Rubio Santner for Metabolic Health Simplified. If this channel has given you one insight today that your last doctor's appointment did not, share this video with someone who needs it. Subscribe so that the next piece of clinical evidence we uncover reaches you before it reaches the mainstream. Your metabolic health is not a fixed destiny. It is a system, and systems, when understood correctly, can always be improved. The single most important next step in your recovery has nothing to do with food or movement. It lives in one overnight biological process that most people over 60 are unknowingly disrupting every single night. That is exactly what we are breaking down in the next video. Do not miss it.